Helen Foster spent 40 years believing her life was built on truth. She believed in her marriage, her family, her place in the world. But everything changed the day a stranger claimed part of the life she thought was hers. At the reading of the will, the man she trusted most revealed one last, devastating betrayal. A second heir, a second life, a second set of promises made in secret. Who was Ethan Cole? And why had Charles hidden a son in the shadows? This isn't just about inheritance. It's a fight for identity, loyalty, and the truth buried beneath years of lies. Stay with us until the end, because when the truth finally surfaces, no one will leave unchanged. Tell us, where are you watching from? Your story matters too. Helen Foster sat motionless at the edge of the polished oak pew, the cold surface pressing against her palms as the final prayer echoed through the cavernous church. Her gaze remained locked on the simple, dark wood casket at the altar, inside of which lay the body of Charles Foster, the man who had been her husband, companion, and she had believed confidant for over 4 decades. As the service concluded, mourners shuffled toward the exit, their whispers trailing behind them like thin smoke. Helen's fingers instinctively found her wedding ring, twisting the worn band with a nervous precision. The chill of the metal grounded her, a reminder of the life she thought she knew, now slipping irreversibly into the past. The reading of Charles's will was scheduled for immediately after the burial, an arrangement he had insisted on long before his unexpected passing. Helen entered the dimly lit conference room of Foster and Klein law offices, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her eldest son, David, stood rigidly in the corner, arms crossed, a look of wary expectation on his face. Family friends murmured greetings, but Helen barely registered them. Her mind was a maze of fragmented memories and muted grief. She took a seat at the long mahogany table, smoothing the black fabric of her dress, her eyes betraying nothing of the storm gathering within. Mr. Blake, the family attorney for as long as Helen could remember, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses with trembling hands. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice grave. "Per Mr. Foster's final instructions, this will be a full reading, with all named parties present." Helen nodded stiffly, barely hearing him. She expected the proceedings to be straightforward. The house, the lands, the investments, all rightfully remaining within the family's grasp. Yet as Mr. Blake unfolded the thick parchment and began to read, a palpable tension seeped into the room, coiling around the assembled guests like a tightening noose. Midway through the reading, Mr. Blake hesitated, his eyes flickering toward a young man seated inconspicuously near the far end of the room. "Ethan Cole," he announced, his voice faltering slightly, "is to inherit a portion of Mr. Foster's estate as acknowledged biological kin." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Helen's breath caught painfully. In her throat, she turned, her heart hammering against her ribs, to get a better look at the stranger. Ethan stood slowly, his movements awkward, his face pale but determined. He could not have been more than 25, with Charles's piercing grey eyes and a familiar stubborn tilt to his chin, that Helen recognized with a jolt she couldn't explain. Helen's vision blurred as she tried to process the implications. The house, their sprawling ancestral home, the vineyards Charles had spent a lifetime cultivating, and a substantial portion of the fortune were no longer solely under her control. Questions erupted from the gathered family. Who was this boy? Why had they never heard of him? And how could Charles have harbored such a devastating secret? Helen said nothing, her hand still clutching the wedding ring so tightly it bit into her skin. She felt a cold, nauseating certainty blossom within her. Her life, as she had known it, was over. She was no longer the undisputed matriarch of the Foster legacy. She was merely another player in a game she hadn't even known was being played. As the room descended into hushed, furious whispers, Mr. Blake pressed on, outlining the new conditions of ownership and inheritance. Ethan would share equal rights to the house and the lands unless a private settlement could be reached. Helen could scarcely comprehend the legal jargon, her ears ringing with humiliation and rage. David slammed a fist onto the table, his chair scraping back. Violently, "This is a mistake," he growled, but Mr. Blake merely lifted a trembling hand, gesturing for patience. Helen met her son's furious gaze and realized with a bitter pang that the unity their family once projected had fractured beyond repair the moment Charles took his last breath. Ethan, for his part, remained silent, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. When Mr. Blake concluded the reading, he finally spoke, his voice steady despite the evident tension. "I didn't ask for any of this," Ethan said, his words directed more toward Helen than the room at large. "But I have as much right to be here as anyone else." His statement was met with a chorus of disbelieving scoffs and muttered insults. Helen felt herself shrinking beneath the weight of a reality she could neither deny nor escape. The betrayal of Charles's hidden life gnawed at her, each revelation slicing, deeper than the last. Rising slowly from her seat, Helen gripped the table for balance. Her knees threatened to buckle under the enormity of it all, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. With a quiet dignity that had once been her armor, she slipped the aging wedding band from her finger, holding it in her palm like a relic of a fallen kingdom. She cast one last glance around the room, at the shocked faces of her children, at the resolute posture of Ethan Cole, at the crumbling edifice of the life she thought unshakable, and turned on her heel. Without a word, she exited the room, the echo of her departure leaving a void that no one dared to fill. Helen pushed open the heavy door of the library, her hands trembling with a fury she could barely contain. The scent of old paper and polished wood hit her immediately, memories of a once stable life flooding her senses in a cruel mockery. She didn't bother switching on the lights. She knew every inch of this room. It had been her sanctuary, her retreat during Charles's long business trips. Now it was her battlefield. Slamming a stack of yellowed legal documents onto the massive desk, she ripped open folders with desperate precision. There had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding she could cling to, but no matter where she looked, the evidence loomed back at her. Ethan Cole, listed neatly under beneficiaries in case of death, in documents bearing Charles's unmistakable signature. Her fingers dug into the pages, her breath growing shallow as she realized it was true. The betrayal wasn't a whisper in her mind anymore. It screamed at her from the ink and paper Charles had left behind. The knock on the library door startled her. She yanked it open without thinking, her eyes meeting Ethan's. He stood there, an envelope clutched in his hand, his posture hesitant but unyielding. Helen's mouth tightened into a hard line. "What do you want now?" she snapped, stepping back just enough to allow him inside. Ethan crossed the threshold, his gaze darting briefly around the room before settling back on her. "You deserve to see this," he said quietly, extending the envelope toward her. Suspicion flared within her, but pride kept her spine rigid. She snatched the envelope from him and ripped it open, her hands moving with mechanical fury. Inside were letters, personal, intimate letters in Charles's familiar hand, addressed to Ethan, acknowledging him as his son, apologizing for the years lost, promising to secure his future. Helen read the words once, twice, 3 times, hoping they would blur into lies. But they remained, searing into her like brands she could never erase. "You think a few letters are enough to undo 40 years of marriage?" Helen hissed, her voice low, but deadly. Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to undo anything," he said. "I'm just claiming what he gave me. I didn't ask to be born into this. I didn't even know about him until I was 15. Helen's hands shook so violently that she dropped the letters onto the floor, watching them scatter. Like fallen leaves, her mind spiraled, grasping at any defense, any shred of dignity she could muster. Yet nothing could stop the humiliation already seeping through the walls of her home, poisoning every corner of her carefully cultivated life. She saw it in the pitying looks of her neighbors, felt it in the brittle smiles of the women at the church. Word was spreading, as surely as if it had been carved into stone. Charles Foster's widow wasn't just grieving, she was a fool. Days passed in a blur of betrayal and shame. Helen stayed hidden inside the house, refusing calls, drawing the curtains tight against the prying eyes of a town that had once revered her. The local newspaper's society column had printed a thinly veiled article, "Prominent Businessman's Hidden Legacy Surfaces." Helen had read it 3 times before throwing it into the fireplace, watching the flames devour her dignity. Friends she had shared decades with now offered only curt, uncomfortable greetings or avoided her altogether. Invitations stopped arriving. Her world shrank, her solitude wrapping around her like a straitjacket. In the privacy of the library, Helen pored over Charles's old journals, business, ledgers and correspondence, desperate to find a contradiction, a proof that Ethan was a fraud. But each page she turned only tightened the noose around her crumbling certainty. Ethan, for his part, remained at a distance, but unrelenting. Helen caught glimpses of him through the windows, pacing the grounds like a ghost who refused to leave. She hated how much he resembled Charles, the same stubborn set of the jaw, the same way he pushed his hands into his pockets when deep in thought. It was infuriating, unbearable. One evening, unable to hold back the storm brewing inside her, Helen confronted him on the back patio. "Why are you still here?" she demanded. Ethan, who had been gazing toward the vineyards, turned slowly to face her. "Because this is my home too," he answered simply. His words cut deeper than any knife. Helen wanted to scream, to slap the insolence from his face, but she held herself in check, knowing that any loss of control would be another triumph for him and another humiliation for her. Inside the house, Helen's isolation grew more pronounced. Even her own children, David and Meredith, avoided her. David's rage had been volcanic at first, but it quickly morphed into an icy, blaming silence. Meredith, always the more diplomatic, tried to console her mother, but Helen saw the doubt flickering in her daughter's eyes. Had Helen truly known the man she had spent 40 years beside? That unspoken question hovered between them, poisoning their conversations, making every interaction brittle and strained. Helen often retreated to the library, sitting for hours surrounded by dusty tomes and the broken remnants of her once proud life, nursing wounds too deep for words. One evening, as Helen sifted through a neglected stack of legal papers, she found a sealed envelope addressed to her in Charles's handwriting. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tore it open. The letter inside was brief but devastating. Charles confessed his mistakes, admitted that he had tried to do right by Ethan without hurting Helen. He wrote of love, regret, and the impossible, choices that had haunted him in his final years. Helen crushed the letter in her fist, the paper crackling like brittle bones. Rage and sorrow warred inside her, leaving her hollowed out and gasping for air. There were no answers here, only more questions, more betrayals, more burdens left behind by a man who had promised her the world and then destroyed it with a single revelation. Late into the night, Helen remained awake in the library, staring blankly at the piles of documents and letters. Her mind circled 1,000 accusations, 1,000 memories now tainted by doubt. Had Charles ever loved her? Or had she simply been the convenient wife, the respectable front for a life riddled with secrets? She thought of the looks exchanged at the funeral, the whispers she had pretended not to hear. Poor Helen, they must have said. She had no idea. The thought made her stomach churn. She had to regain control, had to find a way to reclaim the life that was slipping through her fingers like sand. But how do you fight a ghost? How do you win a battle against a truth you cannot erase? "I want answers, and I want them now," Helen demanded, slamming her hand against the heavy oak desk in Mr. Carter's office, the seasoned lawyer she had hired only days earlier. Mr. Carter, a man in his early 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for tenacity, gave a slow, measured nod. Across from him, seated rigidly in the leather chair, was Philip Moore, the private investigator Carter had recommended. A wiry man with a meticulous air about him. Helen leaned forward, her voice taut. "I don't care what it costs. Find out everything about this Ethan Cole, his mother, his upbringing, how Charles was involved. Leave nothing untouched." Moore scribbled in his notebook, his pen moving rapidly as he processed the urgency in Helen's tone. Without further ceremony, he stood, pocketed his notes, and promised his first report within 48 hours. Helen watched him leave, a hollow hope stirring inside her. This wasn't just about protecting her dignity anymore. It was about reclaiming the life that Charles's betrayal had stolen from her. True to his word, Moore returned 2 days later, carrying a thick folder under his arm. Helen could barely keep her hands steady as she ushered him into the library. Without waiting for pleasantries, he opened the folder and began to explain what he had found. "Charles Foster," Moore said, "purchased a second property 18 miles away, registered under a shell company to avoid direct ties." He spread out photographs on the desk, images of a modest but well-kept 2-story house along a dusty rural road. Helen's heart thudded painfully as she stared at the home that had absorbed decades of Charles's secret life. Moore continued, pointing to photos of a woman smiling from the porch and of a younger Ethan playing in the yard. "Her name is Gloria Reynolds," Moore explained. "They lived there for over 20 years. Financial records show regular transfers, enough to keep the household comfortable, but not extravagant." Helen picked up a photo with trembling fingers, her stomach twisting at the sight of a birthday party she had never attended. A family she had never known existed. "I need to see it for myself," Helen said suddenly, the decision crystallizing before the investigator could finish his summary. Carter cautioned her against it, warning that confronting the past so directly could be more devastating than she imagined. But Helen was resolute. Armed with the address, she drove herself, unwilling to let anyone else bear witness to her humiliation. The drive was longer than she expected, the landscape growing rougher, less polished, as the town faded behind her. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles whitened, each mile feeling like a descent into a personal hell she hadn't known she would ever have to face. When she finally pulled onto the narrow, dusty road and caught her first glimpse of the house, a lump formed in her throat so fierce she could barely swallow. There it was, painted, white with blue shutters, flowers blooming neatly along the path, an image of simple domesticity Charles had never shared with her. Helen parked a few yards away and sat for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. The porch creaked as a breeze stirred it, and for a second, Helen imagined Charles stepping out with a mug of coffee, laughing with a woman who wasn't her. Her vision blurred. She wiped her eyes fiercely, angry at herself for the weakness. She got out of the car, each step toward the house feeling like a betrayal of the woman she had been. Through the window she could see framed photographs lined neatly along the walls, family moments frozen in time. She approached the door, noticing the welcome mat, the well-oiled hinges, the potted plants, details that screamed of a life lovingly tended. A neighbor across the way watched her with cautious curiosity, but Helen ignored them, her focus solely on the painful reality in front of her. The door was unlocked. Helen pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell of lemon polish and something faintly floral assaulted her senses. Everywhere she looked, there were photographs. Charles holding a toddler Ethan, Charles grinning. Alongside Gloria at a picnic, Charles building a swing set in the backyard. Helen's knees nearly buckled. She stumbled toward the nearest wall, tracing a shaking hand over a framed photo where Charles, looking years younger and infinitely more carefree, hugged Gloria from behind as they both laughed. It was not the formal public Charles she had known, the one always composed, always mindful of appearances. This was a man who had let down his guard, who had loved without reserve. Helen's vision narrowed, the edges of her world collapsing inward under the weight of betrayal. She moved through the house in a daze, taking in the small but telling details. A worn recliner bearing the imprint of a body that had spent years there, a book of poetry on the coffee table, open and dog-eared, children's drawings tacked proudly to the refrigerator. Each object was another nail in the coffin of her old life. In the kitchen, she found a drawer filled with old receipts and letters. Flipping through them mechanically, she found Charles's handwriting again and again. Affectionate notes, small instructions about household repairs, messages signed, "Love, Charles." Helen clutched a handful of them to her chest, the weight of decades of lies pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. In that moment, she realized there had been two Charles Fosters, the one she had married and the one she had never known, who had built an entire existence just a few miles away. When she finally stumbled back out into the sunlight, Helen felt hollowed out, as if the ground had opened beneath her and swallowed her whole. She climbed into her car, resting her forehead against the steering wheel as shudders racked her body. The drive back to her own house passed in a blur. Helen was no longer sure what was real, or what parts of her life had merely been a carefully constructed illusion. She thought of the pitying looks she would endure when the full truth inevitably surfaced. She thought of David and Meredith, how they would react knowing their father had lived a second life without them. Worst of all, she thought of Charles's smile, of the man who had once promised her forever, and realized she didn't know if she had ever truly known him at all. That night, sitting alone in the library surrounded by the wreckage of her memories, Helen made a decision. She could not allow herself to be paralyzed by betrayal. If Charles had built another life, she would build a new life of her own, one free from the shadows of lies. The pain was a living thing inside her, gnawing at her resolve, but she forced herself to endure it. She gathered all the evidence, the photos, the letters, the receipts, and locked them in a drawer. Tomorrow, she would meet with Carter and Moore again. Tomorrow, she would begin planning the next move. She would not allow Ethan, Gloria, or even the ghost of Charles Foster to dictate her future. The past had already taken too much. It would not take her soul as well. "I found something you need to see," Philip Moore announced without preamble, placing a thick binder on Helen's desk. She gestured sharply for him to continue, her patience razor-thin after days of torment and speculation. Moore opened the binder to a series of detailed reports and photographs. For nearly 20 years, Charles maintained a strict routine. Twice a month, almost without exception, he traveled under the guise of business trips. Moore's voice hardened. Each of those trips ended at Gloria Reynolds' home. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, even traffic tickets, all lead directly back to her. Helen stared at the documents, her mind piecing together the endless excuses Charles had fed her over the years. Conferences in neighboring cities, emergency meetings with partners, overnight stays for deals that never seemed to materialize. The realization hit her with brutal force. Every fabricated meeting, every hastily planned trip, had been a thread in the web he had woven around her life. She reached out, running her fingertips over the damning receipts, as if by touching them, she might undo the truth they carried. Moore continued, his tone becoming almost clinical. "Ethan was raised to believe Charles loved him deeply. Gloria told him that his father couldn't be with them openly because of obligations he had elsewhere. Ethan grew up worshipping the man who visited him faithfully, always bearing gifts, attending birthdays and school events in secret." Helen clenched, her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms until pain blossomed there. She remembered the business trips that always fell on her birthday or important anniversaries, the carefully wrapped jewelry Charles would leave behind as an apology. She had accepted his absences with the blind trust of a loyal wife, never suspecting the double life unfolding just a few miles away. It wasn't just the betrayal that shredded her. It was the realization that her loneliness had been engineered, planned, and justified by the man she had devoted her life to. "There's something else," Moore said. Moore, flipping to a page marked Testimonies. He slid a transcript across the table. It was an interview with Ethan, conducted discreetly. Helen's eyes scanned the lines, her chest tightening with every word. Ethan had no sympathy for her. In his mind, Helen had been the barrier between him and his father, the reason Charles could never claim him publicly. She kept him trapped, Ethan had said. If it wasn't for her, maybe he wouldn't have had to hide us. Helen dropped the transcript as if it had burned her. It was easier to picture Ethan as an opportunist, someone exploiting Charles's memory for personal gain. But these words weren't calculated manipulation. They were the raw, festering pain of a boy abandoned in the shadows. A boy who had constructed his own version of reality to survive the unbearable absence of a father who chose appearances over love. Sinking into her chair, Helen struggled to reconcile the dual versions of Charles that now haunted her. She thought of the man who held her hand in hospital waiting rooms, who laughed with her during lazy Sunday afternoons, who whispered promises under the covers at night. Was that love genuine, or had it always been tainted by guilt? Across town, Gloria must have built her own memories, woven her own tapestry of stolen moments. Helen envisioned their lives running parallel for decades, two women unknowingly tethered to the same man, breathing the same lies. She tried to summon hatred for Gloria, for Ethan, for anyone who wasn't herself. But the betrayal was too vast, too intricately spun. It left no room for clean, righteous anger, only a sprawling emptiness that Helen feared she might never fill. The memories came unbidden, sharp and merciless. Helen recalled the weekend trips Charles had insisted she skip because of imagined illnesses or pressing errands. She remembered him arriving home with traces of foreign cologne on his jacket, easily explained away as an occupational hazard of crowded meetings. She thought of nights spent waiting by the window, convincing herself that success demanded sacrifices, and that Charles's absence was proof of his ambition, not of another family hidden just beyond the horizon. Every lie he told her had demanded her silent complicity, and she had given it freely, never daring to question the man she loved. The full horror of it unfolded in her mind like a grotesque play, each scene another blade slicing deeper into the tissue of her memories. Determined not to break in front of more, Helen cleared her throat and pushed the documents aside. "Find out everything about Gloria Reynolds," she ordered. "Where she is now, what her financial situation looks like, and what Ethan plans to do next." Moore nodded, understanding the steely resolve beneath her brittle exterior. Once he had left, Helen stood and crossed to the tall bookshelves lining the room, running her hands along the spines of the classics Charles had pretended to love. Each book was a lie. Each quote he recited, every story he had shared was tainted now. She yanked a volume free and hurled it across the room, watching with grim satisfaction as it crashed against the fireplace. Rage burned hotter than sorrow now, and she clung to it desperately. Rage could drive her. Rage could protect her from the black hole of grief yawning at her feet. That night, Helen sat alone in the master bedroom, staring at the space on the bed where Charles used to sleep. Her mind drifted to Ethan again, to the child he had once been, waiting for a father who would never fully arrive. She realized with a bitter pang that she and Ethan were both victims in different ways, collateral damage in Charles Foster's lifelong performance. Yet Ethan's view of her as the enemy, the obstacle, only deepened her isolation. There would be no reconciliation, no mutual understanding forged in the ruins. Helen was alone, facing a shattered future where even the meaning of her past was now suspect. She pulled the covers tighter around her, trying to find warmth in a house that suddenly felt as alien as Gloria's home had. The next morning, Helen rose with grim determination. She dressed carefully, choosing a suit that commanded respect without inviting pity. She had a meeting with Carter and Moore to discuss the legal ramifications of Ethan's inheritance claim and to prepare for the inevitable battles to come. As she fastened the simple gold necklace Charles had given her on their 20th anniversary, She stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same Helen Foster who had buried her husband weeks ago. This woman was harder, stripped of illusions, forged in betrayal. She would not be defeated. If Charles had spent his life building walls of lies, Helen would tear them down brick by brick until there was nothing left of the empire he had built on deceit. "You've been served, Mrs. Foster," the process server announced as he handed Helen a thick envelope. She accepted it without a word, her fingers tightening on the paper as if trying to crush its contents before even reading them. Back inside the house, she tore it open and scanned the first page. Ethan Cole versus Helen Foster. He had filed an official lawsuit seeking to claim legal ownership of the mansion she had called home for more than 40 years. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she caught herself against the wall, refusing to show weakness even in the solitude of her own crumbling sanctuary. Without hesitation, she called Carter, her attorney, summoning him to the house. By the time he arrived, Helen had already cleared a space on the dining room table, stacking legal documents, Charles's old correspondence, and anything else she thought might help her case. As Carter read through the complaint, his frown deepened. "There are complications," he said finally, his voice heavy. "The will was crafted in a way that heavily favors Ethan's claim. There's no easy way to dispute it." "I will not leave this house," Helen said, her voice low but firm. Carter didn't immediately respond. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, weighing his words carefully. "Legally, you might not have a choice," he said. "The will grants Ethan significant interest in the property. If the court rules in his favor, he could force a sale. And from the way this complaint is structured, that's exactly what he intends to do." Helen clenched her jaw, rage and fear colliding inside her. "Then we fight," she hissed. Carter nodded, although there was little conviction behind his gesture. Helen understood. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a siege against her. Memories, her identity, everything she had built alongside Charles, even if those foundations now felt like sand. As Carter outlined a brutal litigation strategy, Helen listened with grim determination, knowing this would not just be about property or money. It would be about survival. The court. Dates came faster than Helen could have prepared for. Each appearance was a public spectacle, attended by curious neighbors and former friends who now treated her more like a sideshow than a peer. Helen sat stiffly beside Carter in the courtroom, her black suit immaculate, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Ethan appeared, flanked by his own legal team. Young, aggressive, hungry. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on his attorney's whispered instructions. As the trial began, both sides laid out their arguments. Helen's team emphasized her decades of occupancy, the life she had built, the reputation she had upheld alongside Charles. Ethan's attorneys, however, wielded the will like a weapon, pointing out every clause that favored him, every statement Charles had made in writing to secure Ethan's rights. When the judge nodded gravely at several key points in Ethan's favor, Helen felt her stomach knot. The law, it seemed, had no room for loyalty, only for paperwork, and Charles had been meticulous in betraying her even beyond death. Helen returned home after each grueling court session to a house that no longer felt like her own. The walls, once warm with laughter and life, seemed to shrink around her. She packed slowly, deliberately, refusing to let the task become a frantic escape. Suitcases and cardboard boxes littered the polished floors, half filled with the remnants of a life now deemed negotiable by the courts. She wrapped photo frames in old towels, her hands shaking as she placed them into boxes. One of the frames slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. She stood over it, staring at the fractured glass, the distorted image of her younger self, and Charles staring back up at her from among the shards. Helen didn't cry. She simply crouched down, gathered the broken pieces carefully, and threw them away, understanding that no glue could fix what had been shattered in her life. By the third week of hearings, it was clear to everyone involved that Helen's case was unraveling. The judge listened sympathetically, but ultimately ruled that Ethan's claim had strong legal standing. Unless a private settlement could be reached, a settlement that would mean surrendering the house at a fraction of its value, Helen would be evicted. Carter explained the terms to her in the dim library where she had once dreamed of. Growing old with Charles. You have days, maybe a week if we file another motion, Carter said quietly. Helen nodded, feeling oddly detached from her own fate. She moved through the house in a daze that evening, touching the walls, the furniture, the small imperfections she had once loved, the creak in the stairwell, the chipped tile in the bathroom, knowing soon it would all belong to someone else. Each object seemed to whisper a painful goodbye, a reminder that even the past could be stolen from her when she least expected it. On her final night in the house, Helen sat in the living room, surrounded by the last of her packed belongings. The once proud mansion looked stripped and skeletal, its grandeur hollowed out. She stared at the empty shelves, the barren walls, the faint impressions where paintings once hung. All her life, this house had been her anchor, her fortress. It had seen her children grow, her marriage thrive and collapse, her dreams take root and wither, and now it had betrayed her, just as surely as Charles had. She pulled an old quilt around her shoulders and closed her eyes, listening not for the comforting sounds of family life, but for the emptiness that answered back. She thought of Ethan, of the boy who saw her not as a victim, but as a thief who had stolen his rightful place. The bitterness lodged deep in her chest, but there was no room left for hatred, only grief. When the movers came the next morning, Helen gave instructions in a calm, detached voice. They loaded the last of her things into a rented truck, leaving behind only the echoes of a life that no longer existed. She locked the front door one final time and placed the key into the envelope provided by Ethan's lawyers. As she stood on the porch, she allowed herself a last look at the house, a structure that had once contained her dreams, her laughter, her hopes. Now it was just wood, stone, and broken promises. Helen turned away without a word, carrying nothing with her but the weight of what had been lost. She climbed into her car, started the engine, and drove away. From the only home she had ever truly known, not knowing where the road would lead, but understanding with painful clarity that there was no turning back. "Start from the beginning," Helen ordered Carter, as she dumped a new box of Charles's old financial records onto the table. The worn folders slid across the wood, spilling receipts, contracts, and handwritten notes in all directions. Carter removed his glasses, rubbed his temples, and nodded grimly. Helen had spent the past 2 days digging through every forgotten drawer, every locked cabinet, refusing to surrender quietly. Each document represented a possible weapon, a lifeline against the verdict that had stripped her of her home. Sitting down heavily, Helen pulled the first folder toward her, flicking through it with the mechanical determination of a soldier on the battlefield. "If Ethan thinks he can erase me," she muttered, "he's going to find out how wrong he is." Carter said nothing, merely watching her with an expression that hovered between admiration and concern. He knew the odds were stacked high against her. But Helen, once the emblem of polite society, had been reforged in the fires of betrayal, and she had no intention of fading quietly into irrelevance. Helen found the first anomaly late that evening, her eyes burning from hours of scanning fine print under the flickering light of an old lamp. It was a simple receipt for a wire transfer dated 12 years prior, large enough to raise eyebrows, but oddly lacking a corresponding entry in the family's official financial records. She frowned, flipping through Charles's meticulously maintained ledgers. There was no mention of the transaction, no meeting, no project, no investment that explained where such a large sum had gone. Heart hammering, she dug deeper, pulling old tax returns, audit documents, and bank statements into messy piles around her. Patterns began to emerge, repeated payments to unidentified accounts, donations to shell charities, investments that had mysteriously disappeared without returns. She underlined entries, scribbling frantic notes in the margins. If Charles had hidden one part of his life from her, perhaps he had hidden more. And if she could prove inconsistencies, she might unravel the case that Ethan had built atop what now looked suspiciously like a decaying foundation. "These numbers don't add up," Helen said sharply when Carter returned the next morning. She shoved the folder at him, pointing to the highlighted discrepancies. Carter adjusted his glasses, skimming through the papers with growing alarm. "These could suggest asset manipulation," he muttered. "If Charles funneled money illegally or hid assets, it could invalidate parts of the will." Helen's breath caught. It was the first real glimmer of hope she had felt in weeks. Carter, seeing the change in her posture, quickly tempered expectations. "We need evidence of intent," he warned. "Not just missing money. We must prove deliberate fraud or concealment that directly impacts the estate's legitimacy." Helen nodded grimly. It wouldn't be enough to hint at corruption. She needed to expose it, drag it, kicking and screaming, into the light where no court could ignore it. She returned to the heap of papers, renewed urgency propelling her forward. Somewhere in these yellowed pages lay the truth. She only had to find it before everything slipped beyond her reach. Forever. By the third day of searching, Helen's body ached from hunching over the table, and her mind felt frayed to the breaking point. But exhaustion was a luxury she could no longer afford. Late into the night, as rain pelted the windows in relentless sheets, she unearthed another critical clue. A contract signed by Charles granting ownership of an investment firm to a beneficiary listed only by initials, EC. Her heart nearly stopped. Ethan Cole. She flipped through corresponding documents, finding inconsistencies in the timelines and legal signatures. The handwriting on the EC contract looked suspiciously different from Charles's usual neat scrawl. Could it have been forged? The idea ignited something fierce inside Helen. She carefully photographed every document, emailed them to Carter, and insisted he hire a forensic analyst to review the signatures. If Ethan's claim to the fortune rested on fraudulent paperwork, she would expose it, no matter how deep she had to dig. Betrayal cut deep, but revenge, she realized, carved even deeper. Helen's suspicions found new validation when Carter called 2 days later, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Preliminary results suggest discrepancies in the signatures," he confirmed. "We'll need a full forensic investigation, but it's enough to motion for discovery. We can subpoena Ethan's documents and financial records." Helen allowed herself a rare, grim smile. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a crack in the facade Ethan had so confidently presented to the world. She imagined him sitting in the mansion now, stripped from her hands, believing he had won, unaware that the ground beneath him was beginning to tremble. "Push forward," she instructed Carter. "Push until there's nothing left standing on his side." She hung up and returned to the library, gathering more evidence, piecing together a case that could not only reclaim her dignity, but also destroy the narrative Ethan had used to paint her as the villain. As she worked, Helen allowed herself a few bitter moments of reflection. She thought of Charles, of how many times he had looked her in the eyes and lied without a flicker of guilt. She remembered Gloria's house, the photographs lining the walls like a testament to a life built on theft. And she thought of Ethan, a boy shaped by absence and secrecy, now a man capable of tearing another person's world apart without remorse. Helen pitied him almost as much as she hated him. He had been raised in the margins of another man's shame, taught to see enemies where there were only victims. But pity would not stop her from fighting. Charles's sins did not absolve Ethan's cruelty. She had mourned enough. Now, it was time to reclaim what fragments of her life she could still salvage, even if it meant dragging everyone through the mud to do so. The next court session was already scheduled, and Carter was preparing a new strategy based on the financial irregularities Helen had uncovered. Helen insisted on being present at every meeting, absorbing every legal nuance, challenging every assumption. She would not be the passive widow anymore. She would be the architect of her own defense. Sitting in Carter's office, she reviewed the documents with a sharp eye, interrupting when necessary, asking questions until she understood the full ramifications of each point. She refused to be blindsided again. If there were any more secrets lurking in the past, she would uncover them first. If there were any more lies, she would be the one to expose them. Helen Foster was not done fighting, not by a long shot. "You'll want to sit down for this," Carter said, placing a sealed manila envelope in front of Helen on the polished surface of his office table. She ignored the chair he gestured toward and tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, she found the document that could turn the entire case on its head, a DNA test result, glaring in its simplicity and cruelty. She scanned the results once, twice, then a third time, each reading confirming the same truth. Ethan Cole was not biologically related to Charles Foster. Her breath caught painfully in her chest, but she quickly steadied herself, the flood of emotions burning away into something colder, sharper. "How sure is this?" she asked, her voice strained but steady. Carter leaned in. "It's ironclad. We cross-checked it with Charles's hospital blood samples and legal paternity records. Ethan's biological father was someone else, no doubt about it. Charles may have loved the boy, may have felt responsible, but he never shared his blood." Helen pressed the document to her chest, feeling a strange combination of vindication and grief. She had fought a war against a phantom, and the real enemy had been the lies Charles left behind like hidden landmines. "We present this tomorrow," Helen said firmly, sliding the DNA report back into the envelope. Carter nodded, but hesitated. "It will devastate him," he warned. "Ethan grew up believing Charles was his father. He may have been cruel to you, but in his mind, he was. Fighting for a legacy he thought was his birthright." Helen's expression hardened. "So was I," she answered. She knew Carter was right. But pity couldn't erase the damage Ethan had done. He had tried to strip her of everything, fueled by a false sense of entitlement. And now he would have to face the ruins of that illusion, just as she had been forced to face the ruins of her own life. As Carter discussed the court procedures, Helen barely listened, her mind already racing ahead to the moment she would walk into that courtroom, the DNA report tucked tightly in her hand, and reclaim what was rightfully hers. The day of the hearing, Helen arrived at the courthouse early, her steps deliberate, her chin high. She clutched the manila envelope as though it were a shield forged from every tear she had refused to shed over the past brutal months. Ethan was already inside, sitting stiffly next to his attorney. He looked tired, thinner than before, his posture rigid with barely concealed anger. Helen took her seat without acknowledging him. When the judge called the session to order, Carter stood immediately. "Your Honor," he said, "we have new, critical evidence that fundamentally alters the standing of this case." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly, but he gestured for Carter to proceed. Helen watched Ethan carefully as Carter approached the bench, the DNA report extended like a weapon. As the judge read, a ripple of confusion passed across Ethan's face, followed by disbelief, then a growing panic. His attorney leaned in, whispering frantically, but Ethan shook his head, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling for breath. When the judge spoke, his voice was final, undeniable. "Based on these results, the court finds that Mr. Ethan Cole is not the biological son of Charles Foster. As such, his claim to the estate, including the Foster mansion, is invalid. The rightful heir, as designated in the absence of other biological descendants, remains Mrs. Helen Foster." Gasps echoed from the small crowd in the gallery. Helen sat utterly still, feeling the moment carve itself into her memory with brutal precision. Ethan swayed slightly in his seat, his face ashen, as if the floor had given way beneath him. Helen watched him, her heart pounding, not with triumph, but with an overwhelming, bittersweet sadness. Ethan wasn't just a usurper. He was a victim of the same man who had shattered her life. The courtroom blurred for a moment as she blinked rapidly, forcing herself to remain composed. She had won, but victory tasted nothing like she imagined. It was hollow, heavy, and drenched in the sorrow of truths too long buried. After the session, Helen stood quietly. Outside the courthouse steps, the DNA results still clutched in her hand. Ethan approached hesitantly, no longer the combative adversary he had been. Now, he looked like a lost child, stripped of everything he thought he knew. He opened his mouth to speak, but seemed unable to find the words. Finally, after a long, aching silence, he simply said, "I didn't know." Helen studied him carefully, seeing the broken edges beneath his crumbling defiance. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. For a moment they stood there, two souls mangled by a man's selfish choices, two survivors of different battles they had never agreed to fight. Helen wanted to hate him, to unleash the anger she had carried for so long, but staring into Ethan's devastated eyes, she realized that revenge would not heal what had been torn apart inside either of them. That night, back at her rented apartment, Helen spread the court documents, the DNA tests, and the battered remnants of her old life across the kitchen table. She stared at them for a long time, tracing the paths of betrayal, grief, and resilience that had led her here. Somewhere along the way, she had become someone new, someone who no longer needed marble halls or family portraits to define her worth. She had lost a husband, a home, friends, illusions, and yet she remained stronger, sharper, unbreakable in ways she had never imagined before. Carefully, she folded the documents and placed them in a plain file box, locking it away in the closet. The past would always haunt her, but it would no longer define her. She poured herself a glass of wine and toasted the silence, the hard-earned peace that had been wrenched from the jaws of so much pain. In the weeks that followed, Helen turned her attention to rebuilding her life on her own terms. The mansion would be sold, and the proceeds legally belonged to her. Yet when Carter asked if she intended to pursue damages against Ethan for the disruption he had caused, she shook her head. "Enough blood has been spilled," she said simply. Some debts were better left uncollected. Ethan had lost more than she could ever exact in court. Helen didn't want to win battles anymore. She wanted freedom from anger, from bitterness, from the chains of a life built on lies. With the settlement finalized, Helen bought a modest house on the other side of town, a place with no ghosts, no memories clinging to its walls. She furnished it herself, one careful piece at a time, savoring the slow, deliberate process of creating something that was wholly, unquestionably hers. "I'm not here to destroy you," Helen said, her voice calm and deliberate as she faced Ethan across the negotiation table. The lawyers remained silent, sensing that this was a moment best left untouched by legal jargon. Ethan's eyes were hollow, drained of the defiance that had once fueled his fight. He nodded slightly, urging her to continue. Helen laid a simple document between them, one she had drafted herself, before allowing Carter to make it official. "I will retain full ownership of the estate," she said, "but I'm establishing a trust fund in your name. It won't be extravagant, but it will be enough for you to start again, honestly." Ethan stared at the paper as if it were written in a language he no longer understood. After a long pause, he looked up. Why? The word carried more weight than any accusation he could have hurled. Helen studied him carefully, searching for traces of the boy who had once waited in vain for a father's love. "Because I refuse to let Charles's lies define the rest of our lives," she said simply, "and because you are not my enemy. You were a victim, just like me." When the agreement was finalized, neither Helen nor Ethan made any grand speeches. There were no handshakes, no hollow apologies, no manufactured gestures of closure. Ethan signed the papers with a shaky hand, stood, and left the room without looking back. Helen remained seated for a long time after he was gone, staring at the blank space he had vacated, feeling a profound emptiness settle around her. She had imagined this day so many times, in anger, in sorrow, in cold calculation. Yet when it finally arrived, it felt less like a victory and more like a quiet surrender to the truth. Some battles were not meant to be won with vengeance. They were meant to be survived, endured, and left behind like old skins no longer fit to be worn. Rising slowly from her chair, Helen collected the signed documents and handed them to Carter, sealing the past inside manila folders where it belonged. Days later, Helen found herself standing in the overgrown garden of the house that was once the center of her world. With deliberate care, she selected a spot near the back fence where the light would fall just right in the mornings. She knelt on the damp earth, a young sapling cradled in her hands. Her fingers dug into the soil, feeling the rawness of it, the primal connection to something that could still grow despite everything that had withered around her. As she planted the tree, she whispered no prayers, made no grand promises. This act was not for Charles or Ethan or anyone else. It was for her. A declaration that life in all its brutal, unforgiving complexity would continue. She packed the earth around the fragile trunk and sat back, wiping her hands on her jeans, her heart heavier and lighter all at once. From a distance, Helen noticed Ethan standing by the gate, watching her. He did not approach, did not call out. Instead, he simply stood. There, a silent figure bearing witness to the quiet rebirth taking place before him. Their eyes met briefly across the garden, and for the first time there was no animosity, no accusation, only a tired, respectful acknowledgement that they were both survivors of the same wreckage, both trying to build something livable from the ruins. Ethan gave a small nod, barely perceptible, and turned away, disappearing down the street without another word. Helen remained seated by the sapling, feeling the weight of that silent exchange settle into her bones. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was enough. Enough to breathe a little easier, enough to begin again. In the weeks that followed, Helen settled into a rhythm she had never known before. She repainted the walls of the house, stripping away the old colors Charles had chosen. She replaced the heavy, imposing furniture with lighter pieces that suited her own tastes. She filled the rooms with fresh flowers, new books, new laughter that was entirely her own. Each change was small but significant, a reclaiming of space that had once suffocated her. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of the sapling growing steadily in the yard and feel a pang of unexpected hope. It reminded her that the past, however brutal, could be composted into something that nourished the future. It was not easy. Grief and anger still lurked in the corners of her mind, but it was possible, and that was enough. One bright afternoon, Helen made her way to the cemetery where Charles was buried. She brought no flowers, no tokens of affection. Instead, she carried only herself, the woman she had fought to become. Standing before his grave, she said nothing. She owed no words to the man who had loved her halfway, who had betrayed her fully. Instead, she stood in silent farewell, a living testament to the fact that she had survived him. She touched the edge of the gravestone lightly, not as a sign of devotion, but as an acknowledgement of the complicated, tangled history they shared. Then she turned away, her back straight, her footsteps steady. She had no intention of returning. The past was buried, and she had no need to exhume it ever again. Driving home, Helen thought of the life ahead, a life unencumbered by shadows she had once mistaken for shelter. She would plant more trees, she decided. She would fill the garden with them, a living forest of forgiveness and survival. Each leaf would whisper her story into the wind, a testament to endurance, to loss, to growth. And maybe someday someone would walk through that garden, feel the strength rooted in its soil, and understand without needing to ask that once here. A woman had refused to be defeated by betrayal. She had chosen life. She had chosen herself. We create each story with a lot of care and dedication, always thinking of you who are part of our family. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment sharing what you learned and how it impacted your life. When you subscribe to our channel, you're not just following our stories, you're strengthening this connection we've built together. Explore our other videos, share your thoughts, and be part of this community that believes in the power of meaningful stories to brighten our days. Your subscription and your like are what keep us motivated to continue bringing you special content. Thank you for being here with us and for being part of this journey. Subscribe, engage, and we'll see you in the next story.